would you wipe out your family to be with me?
The just-released video shows 30-year-old Nichol Kessinger being interrogated.
Did you ever say anything to him about, like...
Never.
Anything about his kids being a problem? Anything about his wife being a problem?
Never. This shocked me just as much as I think it shocked the rest of the world.
She breaks down, sobbing over the gruesome fate of the children, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste.
He's so disgusting. I'm so ashamed of him.
Why? How? I don't even understand how you could, bring yourself to do that to somebody who's, that big.
It begins with a sound most people never hear. The hollow echo of a prison phone clicking into place. A low buzz, a beep, and then silence. On the other end sits a man whose name has become synonymous with terror. A man whose face, once ordinary, now represents one of the most chilling family murders in modern history. Chris Watts. It's been years since the night he annihilated everything he pretended to love. Years since the world learned what happened inside that quiet Colorado home. Years since he stood in front of cameras, staged grief, and begged for the safe return of the family he had already buried in oil fields. But something changed, because deep inside the gray isolation of a maximum security prison, Chris Watts began talking again. Not the rehearsed lines he told reporters. Not the half-truths he whispered to investigators. These were different, longer, more emotional, more dangerous. And then he said something new. He spoke her name, Nichol Kessinger. The woman who stood at the edge of the tragedy like a flickering shadow. The woman whose presence ignited speculation, accusations, theories, and unanswered questions. The woman who vanished from the public eye the moment the truth came out. For years, Chris Watts insisted she knew nothing, that she was innocent, that she was simply a bystander swept into a nightmare she didn't create. Until now. Because in one of his most recent prison conversations, Chris whispered words that sent shockwaves through investigators, true crime analysts, and the very few people still allowed to speak to him. Words that hinted at manipulation, hidden motivations, and a darkness he claims didn't originate inside him, but was encouraged, fueled, and exploited by someone else. In this conversation, Chris didn't just recount the murders. He didn't just revisit the crime. He redefined it. He suggested that the truth, as horrific as it already was even darker. But before we can return to the moment Chris finally broke his silence, before we can dissect the confession that threatens to rewrite everything we thought we understood, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the day when a married father of 2 met a woman who told investigators she barely knew him. A woman Chris insists played a far bigger role than anyone ever realized. This is the story of what Chris Watts finally revealed, and why those revelations are forcing people to look again, this time deeper, into the hidden actions of Nichol Kessinger. A story wrapped in obsession, deception, and the rise of a darkness that didn't begin on the night of the murders, but long before. A darkness Chris now claims he wasn't alone in creating. Long before the headlines, the television specials, and the haunting body cam footage that would replay endlessly across the internet, there was a quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado. Rows of newly built homes, trimmed lawns, and families that looked picture-perfect from the outside. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The kind of place where a man like Chris Watts could blend in effortlessly. By all accounts, Chris wasn't remarkable. He didn't stand out at work, he didn't draw attention in public, and he didn't speak loudly enough to make an impression. He was the kind of man who seemed satisfied hiding behind routine: wake up, work, gym, sleep. His co-workers described him as polite, reserved, predictable, the quiet one. But behind the silence, there was something else. A man who had never learned to confront conflict. A man who avoided confrontation so deeply that dishonesty became easier than truth. A man who nurtured resentment without ever expressing it. The darkness inside him didn't erupt suddenly. It simmered. At home, Shannon was the opposite. Vibrant, driven, the visible heartbeat of the family. She shared everything online. Her struggles, her victories, her kids, her hopes for their future. She worked to build a life that looked full, secure, and warm. And she believed in Chris, believed he was a good man, believed he would protect their daughters with his life. But their marriage, like every marriage, was more complicated behind closed doors. Financial pressure weighed heavy. Communication broke down. And as Shanann's anxiety about the state of their relationship grew, Chris began drifting further into emotional distance. The man who rarely expressed himself was now expressing even less. And then Nichol Kessinger appeared. Her entrance wasn't a dramatic one. She didn't sweep in with intensity or chaos. Started quietly, just like Chris. Small conversations at work, exchanged glances, a growing fascination that soon became something far more dangerous. Nichol was intelligent, confident, and direct in ways Chris had never experienced. She lived a lifestyle he admired, fitness-driven, independent, spontaneous. In her world, he wasn't the exhausted father of two, the husband struggling to keep up with bills, or the man who felt invisible in his own life. With her, he felt seen. It didn't take long for their connection to deepen. Weekend meetups, long nighttime conversations, secret photos, a double life forming so quickly Chris barely noticed the shift. He didn't stop. He didn't think. He didn't question. He followed the feeling. And somewhere along that path, something inside him, something twisted and buried, woke up. For Nichol, according to her statements, the relationship was nothing more than a summer affair, a mistake she wished she had never made. But from Chris' perspective, she represented something bigger. Escape, reinvention, freedom. These contrasting narratives are at the root of why her name still lingers in every discussion about the case. Because while Nichol insisted she knew nothing about his marriage struggles, nothing about the pregnancy, and nothing about the murders, Chris' new prison revelations suggest something entirely different. He describes a relationship that wasn't accidental, a bond that wasn't harmless, an influence that didn't just pull him away from his family, but pushed him into a darkness he claims she encouraged. And whether he is twisting the truth or finally revealing it, the fact remains. Everything began to change the moment Nichol Kessinger entered his world. This was the beginning of the unraveling. One that would end in a crime so brutal, so senseless, that the world still struggles to understand how a man like Chris could commit it. But to understand the full depth of the tragedy, we must follow the red flags that quietly whispered danger long before the murders occurred. They didn't explode all at once. The signs crept in quietly, small shifts in behavior that only made sense in hindsight. At first, they were so subtle that even those closest to the couple brushed them aside as stress, exhaustion, or the growing pains of a young family. But beneath the surface, those red flags were gathering like storm clouds. It began with distance. Chris, once attentive in his quiet way, started pulling away from Sean, and emotionally. The man who used to respond instantly to her messages suddenly grew cold and delayed. His tone changed. His patience thinned. His eyes drifted elsewhere when she spoke. It wasn't dramatic. It was hollow. A quiet withdrawal that Sean noticed but couldn't understand. When she traveled for work, the distance between them grew faster. He stopped answering calls. He sent short, disconnected texts. And sometimes, he said nothing at all. Sean confided in friends that something about him felt off, like he was becoming a stranger inside their own home. Then came the physical changes. Chris threw himself into fitness, obsessively. Hours at the gym, strict diets, a sudden devotion to looking sharper, stronger, younger. Friends noticed the transformation, praising the weight loss, the muscle tone, the newfound confidence. But to Sean it felt like he was preparing for a life she wasn't part of. There were other signs too. Missing money, unexplained purchases, cars parked outside Nichol's apartment for hours, deleted messages, hidden photos. A man who once loved predictability was now living in secrecy. And perhaps the most chilling red flag of all, Chris began rewriting his reality. He confided in certain people that he wasn't happy, that he didn't feel like himself, that the family he once adored now felt like a burden a responsibility he no longer wanted. It wasn't just dissatisfaction. It was detachment. Sean noticed the shift acutely during her final trip to North Carolina. She told friends she felt Chris pulling away more than ever before. She felt him slipping through her fingers, becoming unreachable, cold, distant. She wrote messages describing how her husband's sudden change terrified her. Messages that now read like the final warnings in a story heading toward tragedy. Back in Colorado, the red flags intensified. Chris was spending more nights out, taking long drives with no explanation, turning off his phone, hiding his location. His affair with Nichol, unknown to Sean and at the time, was consuming him emotionally and mentally. He was living two separate identities, each one contradicting the other. Nichol herself became a focal point of suspicion later. Searching for wedding dresses, Googling how to prepare for a new life, deleting communication logs, and showing an intense fascination with the investigation once the murders occurred. Whether these were signs of innocence or guilt remains hotly debated. Meanwhile, Chris was spiraling. He had stopped acting like a man trying to save his marriage. Instead, he acted like a man preparing to abandon it. And the unspoken truth hung above everything. Chris wasn't just drifting away. He was drifting toward something much darker. These red flags weren't just indicators of an affair. They were the earliest warnings of a catastrophic collapse. One that would soon shock the entire world. It began in the quiet, suffocating stillness of an early August morning. One of those hours where the world feels suspended between night and day. The kind of darkness that conceals intentions, hides movement, and swallows sound. Inside the Watts family home, tragedy unfolded in a way so cold, so calculated, that even investigators later struggled to understand how a man could cross such a line. In the version Chris first told police, everything started with an argument. In another version, it began with panic. And in the final version, his prison confession, it began with an intention he refused to label as murder, but one he admitted he had already accepted the moment Sean returned home. What we know for certain is this. Sometime between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., Sean Watts, pregnant with their son, Nico, was strangled to death in the bedroom she shared with her husband. There were no signs of struggle, no signs she had sensed the danger lying next to her, just the quiet horror of a life taken while she slept. What happened next is the part that haunts investigators, psychologists, and millions of people across the world. Chris turned his attention to his children. Bella and Celeste, just 4 and 3 years old, were still alive, still awake, still trusting. In his truck, on the way to the oil site where he worked, Bella asked him a question investigators will never forget. A question that suggested she witnessed more than anyone knew. The details remain some of the most disturbing in true crime history. At the remote oil field, surrounded by the emptiness of open land and industrial silence, Chris carried out the unthinkable. He placed his daughter's bodies into separate oil tanks and buried Sean nearby in a shallow grave scraped into the dirt. A grave so hastily dug it revealed panic, not planning. There was no mercy in those actions. No hesitation recorded in the forensic timeline. No moment where he seemed to reconsider the path he had chosen. Standing alone in the dirt and heat of the Colorado morning, Chris Watts had just wiped out his entire family. But the strangest part? He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't disappear. Instead, he drove home and attempted to restart his life as if nothing had happened. He texted coworkers. He called Shanann's phone. He even invited neighbors into his home to help search for the wife and daughters he already knew would never return. The crime itself was horrifying, but the calmness that followed, the steady mask he wore as if he were capable of detaching himself from reality, was what sent shockwaves through seasoned investigators. It wasn't just murder. It was erasure, a deliberate attempt to remove the very people whose existence once defined him. A crime that felt almost inhuman in its coldness. And it was only the beginning. When Chris Watts pulled into his driveway after disposing of the bodies of his wife and children, he walked into his home with a chilling, uncanny stillness, like a man rehearsing a script written in panic. His phone records showed him making calls, sending messages, and performing a digital dance meant to paint him as a worried husband. But investigators would later note that his behavior didn't resemble fear. It resembled performance. He told coworkers he didn't know where Shannon was. He texted her phone repeatedly, knowing it would never light up again. He even spoke to her friends with a tone that felt strained, wrong, like someone trying to imitate empathy. The first crack in the cover-up appeared only hours later. Shannon's friend, worried after being unable to reach her, called the police. When officers arrived and Chris opened the door, bodycam footage captured the moment that baffled millions. His voice was steady, his eyes restless. He folded his arms across his chest, a defensive posture experts still analyze today. A man who had committed an unimaginable act, yet seemed strangely composed. Inside, the house told its own story. Shannon's phone was found on the couch. Her purse was inside. Her medications were untouched. No sign of a voluntary disappearance. No sign she planned to go anywhere with two small children in the early morning hours. But the strongest clue came from the neighbor's surveillance camera. When he pulled up the footage of Chris backing his truck into the driveway, a move he never made before, the neighbor studied it with growing suspicion. He watched Chris pacing back and forth, moving objects in and out of the truck in a frantic rhythm. He quietly told the officer that Chris wasn't acting right. That was the moment investigators began to shift their focus. Then came the digital evidence. Deleted searches, erased text threads, late-night messages to Nichol Kessinger, photos stored and hidden, hours-long phone calls during the weeks leading up to the murders. It painted a story Chris refused to admit but couldn't hide. He was planning a life without his family, a life with someone else. Nichol cooperated with police, providing her phone, her browser history, and her messages. But the sheer volume of deleted content raised questions that still linger in online discussions and documentaries. Her sudden interest in the case after the crime, searching for news articles, videos, and updates, added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, investigators tracked Chris's movements minute by minute. GPS data led them to the oil site. Phone pings confirmed timelines. Aerial drones spotted disturbed earth near the tanks. And one of the most heartbreaking discoveries came when search teams recovered the bodies, confirming every parent's worst nightmare and sealing Chris's fate. The cover-up unraveled with shocking speed. Chris failed a polygraph test. He stumbled through interviews. He contradicted himself. And the mask he had worn so carefully began to slip. But it wasn't until he was confronted with evidence, undeniable, forensic, precise, that he broke. And even then, he didn't confess the truth. He offered a twisted story meant to shift blame away from himself. The reality was still hidden. The full confession wouldn't come until much later, inside a prison cell, far from freedom, where the truth would finally begin to surface. The interrogation room was cold, not because of the temperature, but because of the tension that hung in the air as Chris sat across from the investigators. His hands trembled only slightly, clasped on the table, his posture tight. He still believed he could talk his way out of this. He still believed the script he had rehearsed in his mind would hold. But trained interrogators know when the performance ends and the truth begins to leak through the cracks. From the first question, something felt off. Chris spoke in clipped sentences. He avoided direct eye contact. He repeated phrases, almost like he was reading from a cue card only he could see. When investigators gently pressed him about Shannon's disappearance, he didn't react like a scared husband. He reacted like someone calculating every answer, someone trying to stay ahead of the story. But the real turning point came when they offered him the polygraph. Most guilty people refuse. Chris didn't, not because he was innocent, but because he believed the lies he had told himself so deeply that he thought he could beat the machine. He couldn't. The polygraph examiner looked at him afterward with a calm, practiced voice. "Chris, you did not pass the test." Something inside him shifted. His face fell, not in fear of what he had done, but in fear of losing control of the narrative. For the first time, he realized the web he had spun was collapsing. They pressed harder. Chris, we know you're not telling us the truth. Chris, we know something happened in that house. He broke, but only halfway. The lie he told next remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. He claimed Sean and killed the children. He said he reacted in rage. He pushed the blame onto the woman he had just murdered. Investigators knew this was impossible. The timeline didn't fit. The evidence didn't match. The injuries on the children disproved everything he'd said. But even in confession, Chris tried to preserve his image. He tried to soften the brutality of his choices. He tried to rewrite reality into something he could live with. His father entered the room then, a gentle man, confused and devastated. Chris leaned on him like a child caught doing something unforgivable. The moment was heartbreaking, but also revealing. His father asked him softly what happened. Chris whispered the lie again. He couldn't bring himself to speak the truth, not because he was ashamed of what he'd done, but because he feared losing sympathy. He feared losing control of the story. Investigators listened. They didn't argue. They knew the truth would reveal itself in time. The partial confession secured his arrest. The evidence secured the charges. And as the world learned the details, public anger exploded. But deep inside those prison walls, something else was happening. The truth, buried under layers of deception, manipulation, and denial, was beginning to surface. Months later, when investigators returned for a follow-up interview, Chris finally admitted the full horror of his actions. But even that confession raised questions. Details shifting, timelines blurring, motives uncertain. Was he finally telling the truth? Or was this just another version of the story, shaped by guilt, pressure, and self-preservation? Even today, experts argue over which version is real. The truth, Chris's real, unfiltered truth, did not come easily. Came months after the murders. Came after the trial. It came after he had already begun serving multiple life sentences. It came when there was nothing left for him to save. Not his image, not his freedom, not his future. And even then, the story he told was so dark, so senseless, that investigators struggled to understand how any human being could carry it out. This is the version he confessed in prison, the one that stripped away the lies, the blame-shifting, the rehearsed lines. The version that revealed the horror inside the Watts home. That morning, Sean had returned home from her business trip, tired, pregnant, and emotionally drained. The couple had been arguing for weeks. Chris had grown distant, cold, obsessed with a new life he was fantasizing about and slipping further into with every text and secret phone call. He later described feeling trapped, not by his family, but by the responsibilities he wanted to escape. Investigators and psychologists believe this was the moment his dark fantasy crossed into irreversible reality. He claimed he and Sean argued in the bedroom. He claimed she accused him of cheating. He claimed she told him he'd never see the children again. But none of this justified what came next. According to Chris, something snapped. It was quick, brutal, final. He strangled her with his bare hands. There was no struggle recorded, no defensive wounds, no noise loud enough to wake the neighbors. But the most haunting detail came next, one that shocked even seasoned investigators. The children were still alive. Bella and Cece, confused, innocent, wearing their nightclothes, walked into the bedroom and saw their mother unconscious on the floor. They cried. They asked questions. They clung to their father. Chris admitted he lied to them. He said Mommy was sick. He said they were going for a ride. He loaded Shanann's body into his truck, and the girls climbed in beside her. For 45 minutes, he drove with his daughters alive in the back seat and their mother's body at their feet. Investigators described this part as the hardest to hear. Bella asked if her mommy was okay. Cece leaned against Chris during the drive. Both children trusted the man who had already destroyed their world. At the oil site, the final moments unfolded with unimaginable cruelty. Cece was the first to be killed. Chris placed her small body into the oil tank. Then he turned to Bella, the older sister, the one who understood more, the one who fought back. She pleaded, "Daddy, no." Her last word was "Daddy." The detail that broke investigators was this. Bella had injuries consistent with someone fighting for their life. After both children were dead, Chris dug a shallow grave for Sean and placed her inside. Then, emotionless, he drove back to work and started his day as though nothing had happened. Experts still debate his motive. Was it the affair? The crushing debt? The fantasy of starting over? Or a psychological break he had been hiding for years? One psychologist put it this way. Chris Watts didn't snap. He faded. Piece by piece. He dissolved into a version of himself capable of erasing his own family. And even now, behind bars, he continues to change versions of his story. Small edits, shifting details, attempts to soften the cruelty he can't erase. But the truth remains. What happened in the Watts house that night was not a moment of rage. It was a series of deliberate choices, and the aftermath shook the world. When the full truth of the murders finally emerged, the shockwaves tore through Frederick, Colorado like an unseen storm, slow, heavy, and devastating. The community that once saw the Watts family as picture-perfect now struggled to reconcile the smiling photos on social media with the brutality hidden behind closed doors. Neighbors who watched Bella and Cece ride their bikes, who saw Sean and proudly sharing her pregnancy journey online, felt a kind of grief that was hard to articulate. It wasn't just sorrow, it was betrayal. A betrayal of trust. A betrayal of the image Chris had carefully curated. A betrayal of the belief that evil always looks like a monster, and not a quiet, polite man barbecuing in his driveway. Shanann's family, the Razuseks, faced a devastation beyond anything words can hold. They had lost a daughter, 2 granddaughters, and an unborn grandson named Nico. They mourned not just 4 lives, but the future that should have been filled with birthdays, holidays, tiny handprints, and the laughter of growing children. In interviews, Shanann's father struggled to speak without breaking. Her mother described sleepless nights and haunting silence in the house. Their pain became a permanent part of the case, a reminder that true crime is not entertainment. It's real, and the victims leave behind families who never get to heal completely. The community lit candles, held vigils, and left flowers on the Watts' front lawn. But behind the sympathy was a lingering question that unsettled even the most hardened detectives. How does a man destroy his entire family without warning? Some pointed to Chris's desire for a fresh start. Some pointed to the influence of Nichol Kessinger, whose involvement, though never criminal, added shadows and unanswered questions. Some pointed to a psychological emptiness inside Chris that no one noticed until it was too late. In the years that followed, the Watts case became one of the most dissected crimes in modern history. Documentaries, interviews, leaked letters, and psychological analyses tried to pull apart the mind of a man who should have been incapable of such violence. And yet, the final truth remains unmistakably simple. This was not a crime of passion. This was not an accident. This was a decision, a sequence of cold, deliberate choices made by a man who valued a fantasy over the lives of his own family. Chris Watts is now serving 5 life sentences with no possibility of parole. His world is reduced to a cell, a routine, and an eternity of reflection. He will die in prison, and the names of the people he murdered will remain fixed in the world forever. Loved, remembered, honored. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Their story continues to serve as a cautionary tale about hidden darkness, the fragility of trust, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous person in a home is the one smiling in the family photo. The echoes of their loss linger, in the quiet moments, in the communities that still mourn, and in the questions that will never fully be answered. In the end, the Watts family murders remind us that evil often hides behind ordinary faces, behind calm voices, behind polite smiles, behind the illusion of a perfect life. But the most haunting part of this story is not the crime. It's how easily it could have remained hidden if not for the persistence of friends, investigators, and the digital footprints Chris failed to erase. Shannon, Bella, Cece, and Nico deserved a lifetime. They deserved love, safety, and a home free of betrayal. They were robbed of all of it by the one person who should have protected them the most. And so, the legacy of this case forces us to ask, how well do we really know the people closest to us? And how much darkness can a smile hide? If this story moved you, or opened your eyes to a truth you didn't expect, don't leave without supporting the channel. It helps us honor victims, tell their stories with respect, and continue shining a light into the shadows where deception thrives. Right arrow like this video to support the victims' voices. Right arrow share it with someone who follows true crime. Right arrow subscribe to Shadow of Deceit for more deep, cinematic cases that uncover the darkest corners of the human mind. Right arrow and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the truth is never as simple as it seems.